Okay, to Cashify and everybody who might think this way, Cashify, you said that, haven't I noticed, to paraphrase, that since I've been having these conversations, I guess you mean on the virtual reality consciousness universe, that I've had these coincidences like seeing Tom Campbell, who has this viral, new age theory book, and then he comes to the island. This kind of coincidence. Haven't I noticed that since I started having these conversations? And this is what you mistake, Cashify, in your attempt to guru to me, which is that you don't understand where I come from. So I'm going to describe where I come from on these kinds of issues. Okay. Now, I was raised on the idea that visualization and focused intent works. Okay. Now, I wasn't a lot of pressure put on me as to how it worked, but I was trained that it worked. But not many of the things that I was trained in my family to think, or I questioned them. Now, visualization, I've questioned a great deal. And yes, I've noticed the coincidence of it and this kind of thing. And there's lots of reasons, lots of contributing factors I have thought of to the power of visualization. There are mundane classical psychological reasons, relatively mundane, and there's very interesting implications in quantum mechanics. Fine. But you have to understand, I already was taught this. I had grandmothers that believed in these new agey ideas, reincarnation, out of body experiences, overlapping parallel universes, and these kinds of ideas. And certainly, this idea that we're in some sort of a VR, which we wouldn't have called it then, right? I was specifically told, by a family member at one time. I thought about this for many years. If you could just visualize a rose in your hand and just see it as though it was really there, that real, it would be there. Okay, and I thought about that for a long time and what that means, if that's true. And I believe it means it wouldn't materially be there, but you wouldn't know the difference. And you're lucky you don't do that, because when you do that, it's called hallucination. Because you can't tell the difference between what is real for other people and what's only real, quote unquote, for you. So basically, I believed in this idea, but as I tend to believe ideas in consideration, that is, I don't have to fully adopt them. I have methodologies that I use to think this through. Okay, so I was very inclined to think that the world was like this VR and you could transcend it. And I explored this in fiction, which is what I often do. And I wrote a story, I think in high school, and I wrote it and read it many times. And through this process, uh, I thought about this subject. Now, when you read a story, you can interpret it different ways. Like, let's say, just to use a crazy example, somebody writes some story that's sympathetic to terrible people, and the terrible people are fighting a war, and maybe it's about the humanity of everybody, and it's as these people are holding out in their last, you know, their last fortress or whatever, as they slowly are defeated. And it's a story sympathetic to them. Like, let's say they're Nazis, and it's sad. You're led to some sympathy with them. Some of them don't even like Nazis. They're just Germans. They're wearing uniforms because they wanted to serve their country. Now, the person writing that story might be writing a sympathetic story to play with your emotions, or for whatever reason. I'm allowed to interpret that story as a reader differently, like, whereas we might think that, hey, look, everybody has humanity, and isn't this sad? I might interpret the story as, oh, it was a bunch of Nazis got what was coming to them. Okay. So in the same sense, when I write a story, I can sit back and then read it with that same kind of eye. So I wrote a story that presented a theory of virtual reality, why things seem the way they are, and they're really some other way. Some other way they could be transcended through conceptions. Okay. But then I read that story and I thought, well, if I read this story not as the author, you know, what does it really seem like? that it's about to me? Is it about this thing of this virtual reality, or is there some subtext that shows, for example, that it couldn't have been virtual reality, and the people that thought that in the story were the mistaken ones? All right, I will describe the story to you. Um, the setting, if not the entire narrative. Okay, so reality is basically space, time, and consciousness. Space, time, and consciousness. Okay. And at the beginning, the story doesn't go into it too much, but there's something like a Big Bang. But the energy involved is pure energy, but it's consciousness energy. And it just goes flying off in all directions. And so these consciousnesses go flying off in all directions. And they have various mental states. And one way of describing their mental state is that they're all sort of insane or, just randomly formed. They fly through space. When they meet another consciousness, they just pass through that other consciousness like energy does, and at the speed of light. So they have only a very brief moment where they're affected by the other consciousness. So their ability to get experience from this is very limited, practically nil. Though over great periods of time, perhaps some sort of interactions could form that way. So mostly these consciousnesses, these consciousi, are all isolated, and they're unable to evolve. The story is about a network of conscious interactive energy called the reality complex. And so this is where we live. And basically what the reality complex is it's a big sticky web of conscious ideas that maximize up the interactivity so that instead of passing through it at the speed of light, if you hit it, if a consciousness randomly hits it, it gets tangled up and incarnates into a manifested body. And the reality complex starts to feed it perceptions, consistent perceptions, so that it can get feedback, right? So that it can learn. And what the reality complex teaches ultimately is a realization that it's just a complex and it can be transcended. Once you understand all it has to teach you, you simply are able to transcend it. But of course, on the way, it teaches things even in contradiction to that, because you have to learn things incrementally, right? So these free consciousness as pass through the reality complex and get caught. And the first thing they're taught is that everything is material and real, and you don't have a choice. You can't transcend. But it only does that to teach the next step, which is more and more transcendence. Now, the reality complex has two operators, characters in the story: the monitor and the morphister. Okay. And the monitor and the morphister watch the reality construct because it's made of consciousness and bits of elemental consciousness. It's not perfect. The monitor watches and has triggers and traps all over. So, for example, if somebody is getting close to an awareness where they can transcend, uh, the monitor has little triggers all over in these consciousnesses and around them to detect that and set off a warning. But there could be false alarms and false warnings, and so these are just two guys that have to go and work on things. And the monitor focuses on watching the system, and the morphister focuses on changing the systems in order to address whatever the trauma might be. Of course, it might be somebody who really is getting close to awareness, and they simply watch to usher that being into its new being. And by then, not only will they have transcended the reality complex, but they'll be trained on interacting with other consciousnesses. They'll have the laws of physics push them into this state of learning how to cooperate in harmony and communicate with other consciousnesses. And so suddenly they'll be more